Hi, everybody. My name is John Ryman, and I'm the former recording secretary and an expelled member of the Carpenters Union Local 713. I was expelled for standing up to the union bureaucracy and for fighting for the membership. And nearly 20 years ago, I wrote a pamphlet called The New Apartheid, The Rise of Zionism, and the Founding of the State of Israel. It's written from a socialist point of view, and because I'm of Jewish descent, I felt that I could write it being completely blunt and without fear of being accused of anti-Semitism. And the reason that I wrote it, understanding the past is key to understanding the present. And understanding the present is the key to shaping our future. So at the time that I wrote it, social media and YouTube and that sort of thing was not really very big at all. And so it was just a pamphlet. So I've decided to reproduce parts of it as a series of videos. So with that understanding, here goes. Now, the founder of the idea that the Jewish people were all one people, Jewish capitalists and Jewish workers alike, was a man named Theodor Herzl, who lived over 100 years ago. And he was born from a capitalist family. He was a journalist. And he traveled the world over, trying to convince different representatives of different wings of the capitalist class to support him in that idea. He met with Abdul Hamid II, the king of the Ottoman Empire, to try to gain his support. He met with Joseph Chamberlain, the key architect of British imperialism, to try to gain the support of British imperialism. He met with Pope Pius X to try to get the Catholic Church's support. Of course, no such endeavor would be complete without trying to gain the support of the Jewish capitalist class. And so he met with Baron Rothschild and other bankers. Where he did not go was to the European Jewish working class. And why was that? There was an ancient Jewish population in Palestine at that time, scattered throughout part of that region. According to the Library of Congress, they numbered about 84,000. Compare that to the Jewish population of Europe in those years, which was close to 10 million. Not only was their number far, far greater, but also their ties to the ancient land of Palestine had been broken centuries and centuries earlier. It's not only that. Also, look at how the Jewish population was scattered all throughout Europe. There was no one contiguous landmass that the great bulk of the Jewish people occupied. They lived in all different countries, had different languages, ate different foods, and their cultures were very different. Compare that to the Kurdish people, for instance, who to this very day tend to be concentrated in one contiguous landmass. They have a common culture, more or less common language, and therefore, in other words, the Kurdish people form a distinct national grouping as opposed to the Jewish people in Europe. In other words, the Jewish people, from Poland to Paris, there was huge differences amongst them. They weren't in one defined area. And the idea that they were one distinct national group who should have their own nation just did not fit with their own material existence, with their own objective experiences and objective conditions in Europe at that time. Which is why Zionism never really achieved any sort of mass base amongst the European Jews all up until the 1930s. Instead, the overwhelming majority of the Jewish workers in Europe supported the Jewish Bund, which was a Jewish socialist party. And the Bund and Zionism were directly hostile to each other. And no wonder. Any socialist poses the idea that workers must unite across all national, ethnic, and religious and racial differences and against all capitalists. Whereas Jewish nationalism, and in the form of Zionism, proposes that all Jews, workers and capitalists, have to unite against everybody else. And of course, whenever workers and capitalists unite, it's always under the leadership, under the domination of the capitalists, which is exactly what happened in Zionism. Which is not to say that the Bund was without its problems, because the Bund was a social democratic party, which means introducing socialism gradually through a whole series of reforms. And like all social democratic parties, that meant that it was unprepared, unequipped to deal with crises in capitalism. And as we know, capitalism is a system of crises. And Europe, Germany first and foremost, really, went into deep, deep crisis in the 1930s. Germany, for example, swung from hyperinflation of tens of thousands of a percent to massive unemployment, with workers being on the brink of outright starvation. Now, I have to do a little aside here, and it might seem irrelevant, but I think, as we will see from this history, it really is not. And the point that I want to make is that the working class is potentially a powerful, powerful force, potentially the most powerful force on the planet, but only if it is organized. And that means organized beyond just within the workplace. It means organized as in society as a whole. And to be organized means to have an organization. And like it or not, a working class organization in society as a whole means a working class political party. Without that, the working class is scattered and disorganized. Now, in Germany, in the 1930s, there were two mass working class parties. The first and the largest was the German Social Democratic Party. And as Social Democrats, what they sought to do was basically a few reforms and to keep German capitalism afloat on the basis of capitalist democracy. But capitalist democracy is only possible under periods of relative stability. Now, the other mass working class party in Germany was the German Communist Party, or KPD. And although smaller, it had millions of German workers in it. And it had come to life after the Russian Revolution of 1917. It drew to it those German workers who were looking for a road to revolution, for a road to overthrowing German capitalism. But by the 1930s, it had been taken over by, as had the world communist movement, it had been taken over by the Soviet corrupt, rotten, reactionary bureaucracy headed by Stalin. And under Stalin, it took one mad, or you might say criminal policy after another, the German Communist Party. In one period, it took the position that the German Social Democratic Party is the enemy and it must be attacked. And on that basis, it actually did attack meetings of the German Social Democratic Party. And this created a huge gap, a huge division within the German working class. They also took the position of, quote, after Hitler, then us, meaning after Hitler comes to power, things will get so bad that workers will want revolution and then will come to power. In fact, of course, just the opposite happened. And in any case, it showed a complete lack of concern for what would happen to Germany's Jews. As part of his war against the ideas of Trotsky, and in fact, against the ideas of the Russian Revolution itself, Stalin also used anti Semitism. Trotsky, of course, was from Jewish descent. And so, caught in this absolute disaster, the disaster of capitalism gone completely haywire, which is what the Nazis represented, and headed towards death by the tens of millions, Europe's Jews had nowhere else to turn but to the reactionary movement of Zionism. Now, let's look at what was happening in Palestine during those decades. And there, following World War I, Palestine was turned over, was taken away from the old Ottoman Empire, and turned over to the British Empire. This was done by the old League of Nations, which was formed in order to, partly in order to determine which parts of Africa and Asia would be dominated and plundered and looted by which imperialist powers, especially the imperialist powers of Europe. Now, in 1917, the British issued the so-called Balfour Declaration, in which they declared their intention of creating a, quote, Jewish homeland in Palestine. Now, Palestine, for them, was to continue to be ruled under British imperialism. They had no more concern for the Jews, actually, than Hitler did later. What they really meant was revealed in a comment by Ronald Storrs, who was the governor of Jerusalem for Britain from 1917 to 1926. And Storrs referred to the Jews in Palestine as our loyal little Jewish Ulster. Ulster, of course, was the mainly Protestant section of Northern Ireland, which the British leaned on, used as a base in order to control their first colony, Ireland itself. So the plan was, and what they actually did, was to bring Jews from Europe into Palestine and use them just as they had used the Protestants in Ireland. Now, as I mentioned, Herzl and his organization, the World Zionist Organization, saw Palestine as being a Jewish homeland under British imperialist rule. But there was another wing of the Zionist movement that, right from the very start, had the goal of Palestine becoming an independent Jewish state. That wing was led by Zev or Vladimir Jabotinsky, and his movement was the revisionist Zionism. Jabotinsky was an outright fascist. His supporters paraded around in the brown shirts, actually of the Nazis. He had tried to collaborate with the anti-Semitic armies of Simon Petlura during the Civil War following the Russian Revolution. And Jabotinsky was very clear on what he stood for. Zionist colonization, even the most restricted, must either be terminated or carried out in defiance of the will of the native, which is to say Palestinian population, he wrote. A Palestine predominantly Jewish, surrounded on all sides by Arab countries, will, in the interest of its own preservation, always tend to lean upon some powerful empire, non-Arab and non-Mohammedan, he continued. Zionism is a colonizing adventure, and therefore it stands or falls by the question of armed force. In another segment, we will see where Jabotinsky's views led during World War II and after. But suffice it to say that Jabotinsky was not some outlier. He was not some irrelevant figure. And today, he is highly revered as being the father of the state of Israel. Here, you can see Netanyahu and others gathering at his grave. Now, there was another wing of Zionism, known as labor Zionism, that played a central role. And labor Zionism within Palestine formed a quasi-union federation, the Histadrut, which is still the main union federation in Israel to this day. And the Histadrut played a central role, especially inside Palestine, in suppressing the Palestinian working class, dominating the Jewish working class, and enabling British imperialism to control the region for an entire period, for decades and decades. And they bear primary responsibility for the creation of deep, deep divides between Jewish and Palestinian workers, divides which, of course, still exist to this very day. I should note, by the way, that both the Palestinian and the Jewish workers tended to resist this, but to no avail, because they lacked an organization through which they could organize. But all of this requires a much more in-depth discussion on the role of Zionism in Palestine itself and relations between Jewish and Palestinian workers. So I think I will reserve that for the next chapter in this series of presentations. And in studying it, just suffice it to say that we can see how the class struggle and resistance to imperialism are integrally connected. So I hope this discussion has been useful and helpful to you, and if so, maybe you would be interested in reading the entire pamphlet, which you can find on oaklandsocialist.com, as well as finding other material on a whole host of different subjects. This is John Ryman of Oakland Socialist, signing off for now.